So who in the world was Jesus? You hear some answers there from random people on the street. I'm sure that as you are here with us today, you have thoughts, you have answers to that question. You know, it's such an important question. As a matter of fact, Jesus, when he was spending time with his disciples, he was kind of growing in fame in the area. He asked his disciples, like, who are people saying that I am? And they gave the various answers from kind of the murmurs in the crowd. And he said, well, who do you say that I am? Who am I to you? In your thought, in your mind, you spent time with me. To his closest followers, he asked the question, who do you say that I am? And I think that we are all in a position to answer that question. That we are all called to answer that question. Who in the world was Jesus? He has a clear impact, a clear influence, and I think that it's an incredibly important question. Because the better we understand who Jesus was in the world, the more clearly we will see who we are to be in the world. Especially for those people who follow Jesus. Like, there's a lot of people who say they follow Jesus with their life that you might question if they really know Jesus, right? If they've really clearly seen or understood who Jesus was. Because they say they follow him, but their life maybe doesn't look anything like the life of Jesus that you've heard about, that you read about in the Gospels. And I would say that that's probably true. There's a lot of people that don't understand who Jesus was. And if you follow Jesus, I think that to know Jesus is incredibly important so that we can know who we are to be in the world. Because while I trust in the death and resurrection of Jesus as part of God's redemptive plan for humanity, I also believe deeply that the words and works, the life of Jesus, is incredibly important to showing us how to be more fully human. That Jesus gives us a path to follow and a way to follow. As a matter of fact, the earliest Christians weren't known as Christians, they were known as people of the way because of the way they followed Jesus. But we all have to ask this question, who in the world was Jesus? There's a thinker, philosopher, author, maybe some of you know him by the name of C.S. Lewis. And he kind of came up with this. It was very popular in philosophy to say that Jesus was a good man, he was a good teacher. And that didn't cut it for C.S. Lewis. Like, he's like, well, hold on, logically that doesn't make sense. And so he kind of comes up with this, with what he calls like his theory, his structure on who Jesus was. And then someone like later on kind of adds another one that I think is very important. So I want to kind of talk about that real quick. That when we look at Jesus and who he claimed to be, it comes down to four things logically. Some of you may be very familiar with this. First off, that Jesus was a liar, right? That he intentionally was deceiving people by his claims to who he was. On the video, we just heard someone say he was a marketing genius, right? Because he got people to follow him. Clearly, their assumption was he was lying about who he was, but people still followed him because of good marketing. It must have been. And so a liar. Now, I would say this. If Jesus was a liar, you cannot follow him, right? Because he cannot be trusted. You can't follow Jesus if he's a liar because you can't trust him. But there's some other options. The other one was lunatic. That Jesus was a crazy person who thought he was God, who thought he was this prophet, who thought he was this teacher, this leader, but ultimately he was a lunatic. He's a crazy person. And you shouldn't follow a crazy person. It can be very, very dangerous, right? So, if Jesus, he can't just be a good person if he's a liar or a lunatic. If he's a liar, he can't be trusted. He's a bad person. If he's a lunatic, he's a crazy person. And you can't trust the teachings either because it's dangerous. And then there was another one that C.S. Lewis didn't articulate, but that someone else added in, that Jesus could be legend. You know, in the same vein as, King Arthur or something like that, right? It's probably based in some kind of truth, but ultimately the stories got blown out of proportion. And that Jesus was ultimately just myth and legend. Doesn't mean that there's not truth involved or facts involved, but that ultimately the story of Jesus is legend. Everything that he claimed to be, or at least that we know he claimed to be, was blown out of proportion. It got bigger later. and that Jesus ultimately is just a legend. And I would say if Jesus is legend, myth, you can follow him to a point, right? That you can follow some of the things that you think are good, but what we end up doing is we end up kind of filtering the good with the bad, I think this is true, I think this is not, but we really aren't sure when it comes to legend. If he's a legend, you can follow him, but only to a point. And so then the other option is that Jesus is Lord, leader, God. You see, that was, when it comes down to it, the most outrageous claims of Jesus were ones of divinity. When it comes down to it, Jesus didn't just say, love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus said that. It's incredibly important. That's a big deal to us here at Downtown Faith, that we love our neighbor as ourselves, that we understand what love is through Jesus. But the claims that Jesus made, he claimed divinity and deity. And so we have to ask ourselves, based on those claims, do I believe that Jesus is a liar, a lunatic, purely legend, or is he Lord? Because if he's Lord, then we should follow completely. We can follow. We can trust. And I think that this dilemma is a dilemma for anyone and everyone who discusses and talks about and thinks about ultimately life and faith, certainly as it relates to Jesus. So I want to look into the Gospel of John throughout this series. And we're going to look at the claims of Jesus. And today we're going to look at his claim of divinity, and then all of the other claims are going to kind of fall off of that. But John is a unique gospel. So the other gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they're tied together. They're called the synoptic gospels, meaning they have the same type of chronological flow of the life of Jesus. It's very kind of laid out. Jesus did this, and then he did this, and then he did this, and then he did this. And you can read Matthew, Mark, Luke together side by side, and you'll see similar stories and a similar flow. But John's gospel is very different. John was the youngest of all the disciples. He was in the inner group. Like Jesus had like his followers, and then he had his closer followers, which included women who actually financed the entire ministry. And then he had the 12 who were kind of those who began to lead what's known as the church after this. And then even within the 12, Jesus had 3 guys that he really poured into: Peter, James, and John. James and John were brothers, and John was the youngest of all of Jesus' closest followers. And John had a special place in Jesus' heart. He was often called the disciple who Jesus loves, although John's the only one that ever refers to himself that way. So we're not sure if that was like his nickname or if that's just how he felt about his relationship with Jesus. Either way, he was incredibly close to Jesus. And his gospel, his account of the life of Jesus is vastly different than the other 3. Not in the stories not being the same, but in the flow, in the way it was written, in the language that he uses. He kind of sees Jesus in this global way, bigger than just this person in history who did certain things, but as this cosmological Christ, this thing that was bigger than just this moment in history. It's almost a very mystical gospel. Christian mystics love to read John's gospel. And what we know about John historically is just like many of the other disciples, he was persecuted for his beliefs and for his leadership. He was actually tarred and feathered. They tried to kill him, and he survived, so they just exiled him to the island of Patmos, and he wrote some other letters to churches from there. But in his account of the life of Jesus, that is historically accurate, probably transcribed by his followers, that people who followed his teachings, it's incredibly different when we look at Jesus. And I want to look at it in this very mystical way. I want to look at what Jesus claims about himself and the metaphors that he uses, and what does that mean about who he was in the world, and can he be trusted, and how does that relate to who we should be in the world. So, Jesus is having a conversation with some religious leaders. It starts to get heated, and this is what they say. The people said, "Now we know you are possessed by a demon." Whoa. Like they went all the way to you must be possessed by a demon because you're saying some crazy things. Even Abraham and the prophets died, but you say anyone who obeys my teaching will never die. Are you greater than our father Abraham? It's a very important question in that time. We're going to talk about that in just a second. Sit with that. He died, and so did the prophets. Who do you think you are? Right? So who in the world was Jesus? They were asking him back then. I think we should be asking it now. Who do you think you are? Jesus answered, if I want glory for myself, it doesn't count. Well, I think you can pull from that right away. He was humble than most of us are, right? If we're in a disagreement, an argument, so who do you think you are? You generally tell them who you think you are. And instead, Jesus does this other thing. He says, if I want glory for myself, it doesn't count. But it is my Father who will glorify me. You say he is our God, but you don't even know him. I know him. If I said otherwise, I would be as great a liar as you. But I do know him and obey him. Your father Abraham rejoiced as he looked forward to my coming. He saw it and was glad. The people said, you aren't even 50 years old. How can you say you have seen Abraham? Jesus answered, I tell the truth. Before Abraham was even born, I am. Now this really fired him up. I don't know if you've ever said something to a crowd that got them as mad as these people. It says at that point they picked up stones to throw at him, but Jesus was hidden from them and left the temple. They tried to stone him, to kill him with rocks because of what he said. So I think it's pretty important for us to look at what he just said. He said, I tell you the truth, right? You want to know who I am? Before Abraham was even born, or before Abraham was even born, I have always been alive. I am. Now, this did two things in the mind of the listener that got them really mad. So here are two things they thought of that got them really mad. And here's the first. Abraham. He sets himself up before Abraham. Now, Abraham, to that group of people that he was speaking to, meant their deep family connection, their covenant with God, their contract, their agreement. They were special because Abraham had a covenant with God. And then this covenant provided a promise that they held on to deeply. And Jesus, as far as they were concerned, this guy, this carpenter's son from Nazareth, put himself above and before Abraham. Above and before this family covenant promise that they held on to so deeply, that they felt like he should be holding on to deeply, but Jesus was doing something different in the world, and he sets himself up above that, and that infuriated them. So when he said, before Abraham was, I am, and then this I am statement, here's why this was so important. There was another guy that they really looked up to in their Jewish culture, and that was Moses. He represented their law, their religion, and their nation. These were founding fathers, if you will, of who they were. And everything about them, this deep-seated identity that went through not just their family, but their law, the way they behaved, the way they viewed God, everything about who they were founded on these two guys. And Jesus says, I am above them. Because here's why they thought of Moses. That phrase, I am. You see, when Moses, as the story goes, was in the wilderness, he was running from God. He was running from his people. He was running from his responsibilities. He actually killed a guy. He was a fugitive. And he's in the desert and he sees a burning bush. He takes off his shoes. He comes to the bush. He has this conversation with God. And when he says, all right, God, I'm going to go, but I need credibility with the people of Israel to free them from slavery from Egypt. Who do I say sent me? And God, through the burning bush, says, I am that I am. The eternal, self-existent one, that's who's sending you to the people. So when Jesus said, before Abraham was, I am, he was setting himself up priority previous to both of these men. And he was setting himself up as God. It was a huge claim for Jesus to make. The claim is this: I am. That's the claim of Jesus. That's the claim of divinity. That's the claim of deity. That's the claim that Jesus wasn't just another good teacher. He wasn't just another good man. He was God in a bod. He talks to a woman at a well, Samaritan woman who their religion was close. It was very similar to that of the Jewish religion, and he's talking to her about this living water, and she doesn't understand. It says, the woman said, I know the Messiah is coming, the one who is called Christ. In the Greek, the word is Christ. In Jewish, in Hebrew, it is Messiah. It is this appointed one. It is this one that the Jewish people had one view of him, this military superpower was going to come in and was going to free them from oppression and raise the Jewish people up as the reigning empire in the world. But what they forgot was that family covenant promise that we just looked at earlier, was that someone would be raised up through their line that would be a blessing to the whole world. It wasn't about this one tribe, it was about the world, which is why John's gospel always talks about the world and this global idea of the Christ. When he comes, he will explain everything to us. And Jesus told her, I am the Messiah. And here's what he was saying with that. Jesus claimed to be the very fabric and foundation of our world. The very fabric and foundation of our world. The thing by which all things were created. Him. Source. Him. Not just this person at a point in history, but this idea that this Christness, the Messiah, has always existed. And put on an earth suit at a point in time in history, at just the right time in history, to accomplish God's redemptive purpose. But that Jesus is bigger than we can even imagine. The fabric and foundation. Now, again, when he says this, we have a choice. We have a response. And in faith, we'll respond one way or another. I don't know, but I think it's this, I don't know. And that's what we're going to be discussing in the series as we look through who Jesus was. But the first and foremost, the biggest 30,000-foot view claim that Jesus made was that he was God.